Pharmacy Assembly and the Saudi Oncology Society. I would like to welcome all of our attendees in this special webinar, and I would like to thank the organizing company Eventrope for their kind sponsorship of this free activity. And it's my pleasure to be a moderator for this session and to introduce to you one of the well-known ID specialist here in the region. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Dr. Abrar Thabit. Dr. Abrar Thabit is currently working as assistant professor at the Faculty of Pharmacy at King Abdulaziz University. In addition to her academic role, she is working also as a consultant clinical pharmacist in infectious diseases at King Abdulaziz University Hospital. Dr. Abrar obtained her pharm degree from the Faculty of Pharmacy at King Abdulaziz University back in 2010. Dr. Abrar also, she obtained her general residency and the specialty residency in infectious diseases from the United States. And also she's obtained certificates of infectious diseases from Harvard Medical School from the States. And she is very well-known speaker in many national and international symposium. And she is also heavily involved in conducting clinical researches in different areas of the infectious diseases. Dr. Abrar today will discuss with us one of the hot topics these days in the oncology field, which is the use of the COVID-19 vaccine in cancer patients. And the title for her today will be Protecting the Cancer Morbid from the New COVID. Please join me to welcome Dr. Abrar Thabit. Dr. Abrar?
Yes, Doctor. Inshallah, my voice is clear?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, thank you very much for attending this presentation for a very hot topic, as Dr. Majid Shamrani mentioned. But first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Majid Shamrani and also the Saudi Oncology Society and the Saudi Oncology Pharmacy Assembly for their kind invitation to present this very important topic of today. So the title of my presentation is Protecting the Cancer Morbid from the New COVID. So I'm gonna begin with a brief introduction, and pretty much all of you have experienced this new COVID-19 disease. So, a new variant of a coronavirus that causes severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, was identified in a case from Wuhan, China. And in January 2020, the first case, the World Health Organization declared this as an emergency, a worldwide emergency or worldwide pandemic. In March, as you may have all experienced, there was a global lockdown all over the world. And in April 2020, the world marked the 1 millionth case of COVID-19. And about 8 months later, in December 2020, just last month, the first COVID vaccine was approved by the Saudi FDA and the US FDA and has been distributed in several countries around the world, which is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which we will talk about comprehensively today, inshallah. So the questions that I'm going to answer today in my presentation is, first of all, why we should be thankful to vaccines, why our vaccines are important in our lives in general, not just speaking about the COVID vaccine, but historically. And then we're going to move on specifically to speak about cancer patients. And so should cancer patients be immunized against COVID-19? And what are the currently available COVID-19 vaccines? And then finally, can cancer patients receive COVID-19 vaccine, and whether or not there are any special precautions or recommendations from cancer specialized organizations? So the first question was why we should be thankful to vaccines. Why are vaccines important to our lives from a historic perspectives? So vaccines are very important because they protect us against infectious diseases, as you know, mumps, measles, rubella, chickenpox, and even cancers such as liver cancer caused by hepatitis B virus, and cervical cancer or genital cancer caused by the human papilloma virus. So several diseases that can cause morbidity and mortality can be prevented by just taking the vaccines. And so, as I mentioned, they decrease the morbidity and eventually the mortality of these infectious diseases, because diseases, some of them can be very severe. Some of them may just impact the quality of life, but some of them can also result in death, such as the tetanus infection or the pneumonia, meningitis, influenza, and all these other infections. It's also important to eradicate infectious diseases. As you may all know, that the World Health Organization recently, and about like few years ago, they announced the global eradication of polio, okay, the virus that causes the paraplegia. And about 50 or 60 years ago, they declared the global eradication of smallpox. So it's very important that we completely eradicate these diseases that spread very fast and result in a great impact on the healthcare systems as well as the economies of the countries. They also prevent antibiotic resistance by reducing the need for their use. How can this happen? As for example, by administering pneumonia and meningitis vaccines, we prevent these infections, these bacterial infections from happening. These bacterial infections, if we overuse antibiotics to treat them, there will be eventually the risk of development of antibiotic resistance because these bacteria are consistently being exposed to antibiotics. So when we use the vaccines to prevent these infections from emerging at the first place, we decrease the use of antibiotics, and then eventually we prevent the risk of emergence of resistance. It's also important, these vaccines are also important to improve the growth and wellness of newborns. So for babies and toddlers and children going into the school, it's very important for them to receive the vaccines so that we avoid the risk of having them hospitalized to be treated from preventable diseases. Eventually, also, these vaccines can increase the human life expectancy. Again, when we talk about vaccines that are given to adults, such as the flu vaccine, the pneumonia vaccine, meningitis vaccines, even the diphtheria, tetanus vaccines, all these are also important vaccines for the adults to receive in order to increase their life expectancy and prevent the mortality in adults. Obviously, and as you may have experienced with the COVID pandemic, having the vaccines can also make traveling easy, and as well as the transportation. As you may all know, the Saudi government prevents the issuance of the Hajj or Umrah visa unless the applicant has a proof of the meningococcal vaccine receipt. So that's one of the important things to avoid the emergence of meningitis. And then finally, improve the economy by saving treatment and hospitalization costs. Again, when we reduce the expenditure of antibiotics and antivirals, we improve, and when we reduce also the need that these patients experiencing severe diseases, when we reduce the need for them to be hospitalized, we will pretty much reduce these expenses. Especially if these diseases are severe enough to have these patients admitted to the ICUs where the costs are very, very high. So again, the vaccines have direct effect by preventing infections, and then eventually they have indirect effect by improving the worldwide economy. So should cancer patients be immunized against COVID-19? Now we're going to switch gear and talk about specifically COVID-19 in a very vulnerable population, which is the cancer patients. So in a study that was done in the UK that was recently published last year, in the UK, in about 1,044 patients with cancer, they found that COVID-19 mortality rate was about 28.25%. So this is about 295 patients of the whole population. This is actually a very considered a high percentage when we're talking just on about the subpopulation of cancer patients. There identified certain risk factors for mortality in these patients. So the presence of these risk factors indicated that these patients would have a more severe picture of COVID-19 and a requirement for intensive clinical support and admission to ICUs. So these risk factors included the presence of hematological cancers. So patients with leukemia, lymphoma, or myeloma were at the highest risk for a severe picture of COVID-19. Also, recent chemotherapy use within the last 4 weeks of COVID-19 presentation. And this is pretty much logic because, as you know, chemotherapy decreases immunity. It's immunosuppressant. So reducing the immunity will cause the virus to be more violent against these patients. Also, older age, and again, with an older age, a patient would experience decrease in the immune system response. And then, interestingly, they also found a more severe picture with male patients than with female patients. Now, when we look at this picture, you can see here we have 3 columns. If we look here at the left column, this is pretty much for all patients, whether they are male and female patients. So as you can see here, the patients with the hematological cancers had the highest mortality rates at 40 to 60%, and then going less with other kinds of cancers. The least kinds of cancers that were associated with fatalities were the breast cancers and female genital organs, and this explains why the female sex was not among the risk factors for mortality and severe picture of the disease. Now, when you look at the male patients, you see more of the pink blocks, which indicates 40 to 60% overall, more so than in the in the female column here. The gray blocks, they represent where the number of the cases were actually less than 4, and so the case fatality rate was not estimable. So what are the currently available COVID-19 vaccines in the market or under the development? Before we speak about the COVID-19 vaccines that are currently available, let's first of all look at the traditional process for the vaccines development and why some people are hesitant or reluctant about receiving the current COVID vaccine because it has been developed fairly quickly. So this is the traditional pathway. So each phase takes about 2 to 3 years with an overall duration of 10 to 15 years. So first of all, we have the exploratory and preclinical, so in vitro and in vivo studies in the lab and in the animals. This is followed by phase 1 clinical study in a small number of human subjects, and to assess the safety of the vaccine, not just the efficacy. And then the next phase goes into phase 2, where we test the vaccine into a little bit of a larger number of subjects for both efficacy and safety after we have determined the appropriate regimen to administer the vaccine. And then after this phase 2 has completed and its results were evaluated, we move to phase 3, where we test, which is the last clinical phase, where we test the vaccine on thousands of human subjects. After that, when the phase 3 is closed and the results are evaluated, the company submits a request for approval from an organization such as the Food and Drug Organization to receive the approval, and then they get the green light to start manufacturing the vaccines and administer them, globally, and provide the post-marketing surveillance. And this itself also can take about 1 to 2 years. Now, with the current situation and in a large pandemic that is impacting the globe from multiple aspects, economically and healthcare and quality of life and so forth. This was a proposed the proposed plan for the development of vaccines in a much shorter period of time, as we have observed with the currently available vaccines, currently approved ones. So in this case, the phases get blended together, they get merged. So while we are exploring the vaccines in the preclinical phase, once we identify a good leading vaccine, a good candidate, they immediately start the phase 1 clinical phase. And then within the phase 1, as we are continuously evaluating the data from each clinical phase, we begin the second phase. And then, after phase 2, also, as we are continuously evaluating, once we feel that think that the vaccine is actually eligible to be tested on a larger number of subjects, then we move into phase 3 vaccine, even though phase 3 clinical trials, even though we are still evaluating data from phase 2 trial, but we have evaluated enough and we included enough number of patients to determine the eligibility of that vaccine for manufacturing later on. And then immediately, once the phase 3 clinical trial is completed, the company files an approval, or they seek an emergency authorization, as in the current phase, as in the current case right now. This is the FDA approval of the current vaccines. As you may have seen, they are not the final approval, but they are emergency use authorization, because we are in a pandemic, we are in a global emergency. So they still need to evaluate, the results of these clinical trials in more details in order to provide a final complete approval. So in general, the total duration is truncated from 10 years to only 1 to 2 years. So what are the currently available COVID-19 vaccines that are currently available in the market worldwide? First and foremost, the one that we have here currently in Saudi Arabia and pretty much in several countries, Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So it's available in multiple countries, including Saudi Arabia. There's also Moderna vaccine that is currently only available in the United States. There's also AstraZeneca Oxford that was recently approved in the United Kingdom. There is Sinopharm, which is a Chinese vaccine available in China and was also studied in the United Arab Emirates. There is Sputnik V that was also recently approved to be used in Russia. So I'm going to talk about each of these vaccines in details, particularly Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and Moderna vaccine, because there are speculations that Moderna vaccine may also be approved by the Saudi FDA. So in March 17, Pfizer and BioNTech announced plans to co-develop a potential COVID-19 vaccine. And 2 months later, they started dosing the first participants. So during these 2 months, they blended, they finished the preclinical phase in vitro and in vivo studies. And then in May 5, they blended the preclinical phase with the phase 1 studies. So they started their studies in the United States. In July 1st, they completed a phase 1 and phase 2. So within 2 months, as you can see, they blended both phases, phase 1 and phase 2 together. So they finished both phases around the same time. And then later on, also like in 3 months later or 4 months later, in November 9th, they completed a phase 3 in more than 43,000 participants with reported 95% efficacy. And if you remember, this was a big news worldwide for the BioNTech vaccine. So okay, and then December 10th, the Saudi FDA approved the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And then December 11th, the next day, the US FDA gave the vaccine the emergency use authorization status. So if you can notice that we actually approved it 1 day before the United States approved it for their population. So some important information, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has to be diluted before use in sterile sodium chloride or normal saline. Each dose or each vial contains about 5 doses, and they're reported that some vials may contain up to 7 doses of 0.3 milliliters for intramuscular injection. The main drawback of this vaccine is the storage. Before the dilution, it has to be stored at super freezing temperatures, minus 80 to minus 60 degrees Celsius, which means they have to be stored in dry ice or like liquid nitrogen. And this really much makes the transportation kind of a difficult of a difficult obstacle in some cases. So once it is diluted, it can be stored in the fridge at 2 to 25 degrees Celsius, when then should be discarded after 6 hours if it was not used. The next vaccine we have is the Moderna vaccine, who like in March 16, the first participant in phase 1 study was dosed. So pretty much around the same time, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine dosed their first participants. In April, they submitted an IND to the United States FDA to initiate their phase 2 study. And then in May, they received the FDA fast track designation. In July, they began their phase 3 clinical trial. So they finished the phase 1 and 2 clinical trial in the spring, and then in the summer they started phase 3, and then in November they announced that they completed their phase 3 in 30,000 participants with 94.1% efficacy. So they had a comparable efficacy to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. In December 18, the United States FDA gave the vaccine the emergency use authorization status. So only about a week. So a Pfizer vaccine received the US FDA EUA in December 11th. 1 week later, on the 18th, the US FDA approved Moderna vaccine for emergency use. In terms of its pharmaceutical formulation, it is a suspension for intramuscular injection. Each vial contains 10 doses instead of 5 doses at 0.5 milliliters each. It has to be stored frozen, but not in super freezing temperatures, regular freezing temperatures. So it can be stored with ice packs, for example, at minus 25 to minus 15 degrees Celsius. But it's also stable in regular refrigerating temperatures for about 30 days, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. And once it is removed from the refrigerator or from cooling temperature, it is stable in the room temperature for up to 12 hours. So in some terms, it can be actually easier for transport. It's easier for transportation than the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, because the ice packs are much, much cheaper than the dry ice or liquid nitrogen when used for transportation. And then we have CureVac vaccine. CureVac vaccine is also the Saudi FDA, or the Ministry of Health here in Saudi Arabia. Before they approved the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, there were news or announcement that they are going to make a contract with the CureVac vaccine company, which is a German company, to receive this vaccine once it completes all the phases. So in January, CureVac started their investigation. They started their preclinical trials. In March 2020, they selected the most suitable vaccine candidates. So they found their leading vaccines that showed promises in their preclinical phases. And then in May, they announced positive preclinical results at low dose for its leading vaccine. So they selected the one only vaccine that will be moved to clinical trials. So in June, they received the regulatory approval from the German and Belgian authorities to initiate their phase 1. So they're a little bit behind the American vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And in September, they initiated their phase 2 clinical trials. And in November, they reported positive interim phase 1 data and stability data, where it can be stable for 3 months at regular refrigerating temperatures at 5 degrees Celsius and up to 24 hours in room temperature. So we are currently waiting for CureVac vaccine to initiate their phase 3 trials and report their results in order to receive final approval from drug agencies. Now let's look at this table. As you can see here, these are the other vaccines that are currently available in the market in other countries worldwide. The first one we see here in the first row is the AstraZeneca University of Oxford. And this one also completed all their phases and received the emergency use authorization from the UK Drug Agency. It's actually a viral vector, so it is their traditional form. And I like to joke here that those people, the conspiracy theorists who are afraid of the new technology that by which the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines develop their own Moderna developed their own vaccines. Those people, if they are very afraid of receiving the new technology, they can receive the standard technologies or the traditional kinds of the viral vaccines. One of which is the British vaccine, okay, and also the other ones like the Chinese, the Russian. All of these three are actually developed using the traditional methods of vaccine development. So the British vaccine reported 62 to 90% efficacy, and it can be manufactured large scale. It is safe and effective. The main disadvantage is that a pre-existing immunity could hamper clinical use and reduce immune response, meaning that patients or people who previously were exposed to COVID-19 vaccine and acquired the disease and then developed immunity may benefit less from this kind of vaccine. In terms of storage, it's similar to the Moderna vaccine, can be stored at refrigerator temperatures. The next one is the Wuhan Institute of Biological Products, or Sinopharm. This one also completed all its phases. It's a Chinese vaccine, and I mentioned that it was also studied in the United Arab Emirates. So phase 3 trial included this country. It's an inactivated viral vaccine. So again, this is a traditional way for vaccine development for those who are afraid of receiving the new technology. It has a lower efficacy at 79 to 80%. And the other advantage is that the pathogen is killed. So this can be very good for people who are immunocompromised, such as cancer patients, those who recently received chemotherapy, as well as patients with other immunosuppressive conditions, such as HIV infection, or even those who are receiving immunologic drugs. So as I mentioned, it has a lower efficacy than its comparators. It produces a weaker immune response and can be stored in the refrigerator. The next one is Gamaleya, or Sputnik V, or Sputnik 5. This is the Russian vaccine. It's also completed it's all these phases, currently approved in Russia. It's also a viral vector, similar to the one produced by AstraZeneca and University of Oxford. 92% effective. And the main disadvantage is that they published the study in the Journal of Lancet. However, so many scientists from all over the world, they had some concerns about the results that were published in their study. So that was pretty much the main concern about the Russian vaccine. But we are yet to see the post-marketing surveillance results and whether or not it is actually indeed effective. It also can be stored in the refrigerator. The last but not least is an American vaccine that is currently in phase 2 to 3 clinical trials developed by Inovio Pharmaceuticals. This one is quite interesting because it was also developed using a different technology, which is a DNA plasmid vaccine with electroprotein. So it is not a messenger RNA vaccine like Moderna's or Pfizer-BioNTech's vaccine. It is a DNA vaccine. And what's interesting about it is the temperature of storage. It can be stored at room temperature. And the company is trying to develop it to be stable at room temperature for months, so which will really pretty much facilitate its transportation, and it is assumed that it's if it's released into the market, it can reach or can be delivered to areas where storage can be very tough, such as countries, the developing countries, or countries with low economies. So it has a reported efficacy of 95%. It does not need to be cultured, so pretty much easier to be manufactured on large scale. The main disadvantage, again, it's a new technology, so there hasn't been any DNA-based vaccine produced. Now, the last question of today is whether or not cancer patients can receive the COVID-19 vaccines that I mentioned previously, and whether or not there are any special precautions. So I'm going to mention some of the recommendations by two major cancer organizations. The first one is the American Cancer Society. And in their recommendations, they mentioned that in general, vaccines need a healthy immune system in order to work. Why is that important? Because simply we are introducing an antigen into the body, and we are inducing the immune system, which should be healthy, to produce antibodies in response to seeing that antigen. So patients who have a weak immune response, or their immune system is actually absent, those patients, unfortunately, will not have a sufficient response to this antigen. And so their immune systems may not produce antibodies, or may produce them in an amount that are very much insufficient in comparison to healthy people. And unfortunately, vaccines clinical trials did not include patients who receive immunosuppressive therapy, such as chemotherapy. This is unfortunate, but it was also expected because typically we want to see whether or not the vaccine is working. So we need a standard immune system. So they only mainly included people with healthy immune system to test the production of antibodies in these people. So in general, if we would like to give the vaccine to a patient with cancer, according to the American Cancer Society, they recommend that vaccines not be given during chemotherapy treatment or radiation treatment, except for influenza vaccine, because there's a previous recommendation that it can be given because it is an inactivated vaccine. And this is to ensure a good response in the presence of a healthy immune system. Okay, so again, they should not be given during the time when the immune system is actually suppressed, during chemotherapy or during the radiation courses. Now, the next set of recommendation was produced by the American Society of Clinical Oncology in collaboration with the Infectious Diseases Society of America. So in their recommendations, they said that immunocompromised individuals may still receive COVID-19 vaccine if they have no contraindications to vaccination in general, if they don't have any sort of allergies to any of the vaccine components. And they also have to continue to follow all current guidance to protect against COVID-19, such as social distancing, wearing the mask, continue to hand sanitize and wash the hands with soap and water to get rid of the to get rid of the virus. While some immunocompromised patients may experience decreased response to the vaccine, again, because patients who are in chemotherapy or radiation may not have a strong immune system to produce antibodies and to provide sufficient immune response, they believe that it may still confirm some benefit to cancer patients, and it's important to reduce the risk of severity of COVID-19. So again, combining this particular recommendation with the recommendation by the American Cancer Society, we can finally reach that an agreement that the COVID-19 vaccine can be given to cancer patients, but try to give it when the immune system is actually recovered. So again, they mentioned that the vaccine should be provided in between cycles of therapy and after appropriate waiting periods for patients receiving stem cell transplants and immune globulin treatments. So the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the IDSA, they particularly specified this recommendation for stem cell transplant recipients and immune globulin treatment recipients. Whereas the American Cancer Society, they mentioned this recommendation for pretty much all cancer patients who receive chemotherapy or radiation. So when we combine both recommendations together, as simple as that, just consider that you don't give the vaccine unless the patient is in the recovery period. Once their immune system is actually recovered after a sufficient amount of time has passed after the end of the treatment cycle. So in summary, as I mentioned initially, vaccines have huge positive impacts on global health and economy. They eradicate infectious diseases, they decrease morbidity and mortality, they improve the quality of life of the human race and increase the life expectancy of people. During the year 2020, several companies have been accelerating their vaccine production programs that we have seen, pretty much companies in the US, in the UK, in China, in Russia, and so forth. In Saudi Arabia, we currently have the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And again, as I mentioned, there are speculations that we may also approve the Moderna vaccine as well as CureVac vaccine, inshallah. And then finally, with regards to cancer patients, they should receive COVID-19 vaccine because they are at risk for mortality and morbidity, particularly patients with hematological cancers. But they should receive these vaccines during periods when their immune systems are recovered. So after sufficient amount of time has passed, after the treatment cycles, whether they are receiving chemotherapy or radiation or immunoglobulin treatment or stem cell transplantation. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I open the floor for questions.
Thanks, Dr. Abrar, for your excellent presentation. And I think now things are more clear with regard to the recommendations for cancer patients, as you mentioned in your summary of your presentation. Now I would like to open the floor for the questions from the audience. I think I will just go over the questions that were posted in the Q&A section. Okay, I think majority of the questions that I checked is like a general questions, not specific for cancer patients, but I'll be trying to focus on the important ones for the oncology practitioners. The first question is about, Dr. Abrar, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Your voice is clear.
Excellent. The first question is about, did you recommend like COVID vaccine for solid organ transplantation?
Yes, again, this patient population, solid organ transplants, are similar to the cancer patients because they are really vulnerable. They are immunosuppressed. So I would assume that they may have also a severe picture of the disease. But this is actually in the recommendations by the Ministry of Health, that those patients with weak immunity, they are at risk of needing an intensive clinical support when they acquire COVID-19. So those are the group of patients who are at high need to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. But again, maybe, because they are immunosuppressed, so there are concerns that the immune system response may not be as optimal. And because solid organ transplant are continuously receiving the immunosuppressive therapy, unlike cancer patients receive cycles at different times. So there are some certain recovery periods in between. Whereas for solid organ transplants, they receive the therapy continuously. So even though, and similar to the recommendation made by the American Society of Clinical Oncology, even though the immune system response may not be optimal, may not be as sufficient or as high as a healthy subject, it may still confirm some benefit. So I would still recommend it for this patient population.
Excellent. What about the dialysis patients? Another question is asking about dialysis patients and if they are considered immunocompromised or not.
Okay, so patients with end-stage renal disease, they're also considered immunocompromised. Patients with end-stage renal disease or liver disease, patients with other comorbidities, even diabetic patients. In general, we consider these patients as vulnerable patients. And they usually, when they acquire different infections, we see them even in clinical practice, they usually acquire the disease in a more severe form. And again, back to the recommendations by the World Health Organization, the Ministry of Health, they strongly recommend that these patients be protected more from COVID-19. And now that the vaccine is available, it is also recommended that these patients receive the vaccine among the high priority groups.
Very clear. Dr. Abrar, I have a question with regard to the success rate of different vaccines. I can see that there is a kind of range, especially in the first vaccine that you have mentioned, the AstraZeneca vaccine. The success rate is around 62 to 9%. So how do we interpret this success rate? Because like most of the practitioners are like asking, what is the definition of success rate of those vaccines?
Okay, so the definition of success basically means that, in general, for a vaccine to be tested for its efficacy the way that they do it in clinical trials. So they do it double-blinded. So one group of people will receive the vaccine, the other group of people will receive, let's say, like a normal saline or just a diluent, or the vehicle where the vaccine is diluted, but without the active ingredient of the vaccine. And then they expose both groups to the disease, to the virus. Okay, and then they assess which group of these patients, which of these people, let's say, because they're not patients typically, they're healthy individuals. So which group of these people who were exposed to COVID-19 virus developed the disease? And then they compare the results. So if we have, and when I say, for example, that the vaccine is 95% effective, if I have two groups of people, 100 in each arm, so 100 receiving the vaccine, and 100 receiving the placebo. In the vaccine group, out of those 100 people, only who received the vaccine and were exposed to COVID-19 virus, only 5 people, 5 out of 100, developed the COVID-19 disease. Whereas 95 people did not develop the disease. So that's how we define basically efficacy. We just see the proportion of people who developed the disease and those who were actually protected from the disease after they received the vaccine. And then we compare the results with the placebo group. Now, as far as the far range in the AstraZeneca vaccine in particular, so the first reported efficacy rate of 62%. This was generated from the phase 3 study. So this is from the, I don't really exactly remember the 1,000 number of patients who were included, but this is from the largest cohort of patients who received the vaccine. Now, the 92% efficacy was reported in the subgroup of old patients. So those who are 65 years or older. They had more than 90% efficacy rate. So that's why it has this wide range of efficacy.
Very clear, Doctor. What about another interesting question? And I think it's from my friend, Dr. Masur Khan. He's asking about the use of vaccine in a transplant patient. He's asking, should we give vaccine to stem cell transplant in general? And what about 3 months versus 6 months post stem cell transplantation? He's mentioning that the European Society of Medical Oncology, ESMO, is recommending 3 months, maybe 6 months versus 3 months. What do you think about the timing for the vaccine for stem cell transplant?
Okay, so I may have little experience in this area, so I cannot really actually provide a specific recommendation. So if any recommendation I would go with is the general recommendation that was made by the American Society of Clinical Oncology, is to give it in between cycles of therapy after appropriate waiting periods for patients receiving stem cell transplants. I think I would defer to experts in this area who may actually have better experience or better knowledge of whether 3 months or 6 months is enough to determine or say that this patient has recovered, or their immune system has recovered to produce enough immune response. But again, back to the recommendation that because we are actually in a global emergency and this is a pandemic, so we actually may need to administer these vaccines as soon as possible to vulnerable patients. So I don't know if waiting 6 months would be too long for these patients. We should weigh benefit versus risk. Like if the risk of acquiring the disease bigger than the benefit that even the little benefit that they may receive from receiving the vaccine if we only wait for 3 months. So I think it has to be based on each case. So maybe the clinician can have the judgment to give it either sooner than later.
Yeah, I agree with you because, in the transplant, in hematological malignancies, we usually have different priorities for those patients. Some patients may need we can give them further chemotherapy and when they postpone the transplant, and other group of patients need the transplant is the only solution. So there is a specific recommendation that was published after the, in the beginning of the pandemic from the American Society of Bone Marrow Transplantation as well as the European Society. So I think, as you mentioned, that this is not easy like decision, and it should be a multidisciplinary decision between the hematologist and the other involved specialists in the care of the another question is about the cost. Is there any do you have any information about the cost of those 4 or 5 vaccines?
I don't have a specific cost information, unfortunately.
Okay, great. Okay, is there any a special is there any major safety concern with those vaccines in general? Is there any mortality case?
There are no general safety concerns. And again, if anything, would be if the person is allergic to any of the vaccine components. Now, as far as the death cases that were reported in the media, unfortunately, the media can report or exaggerate these news before even confirming. So when we dig down into the press release by the US FDA about the 4 cases that were died after receiving Pfizer vaccine, in fact, the majority of these cases were actually in the placebo group. They were not in the group of people who received the vaccine. And then the 1 or 2 patients who were in the vaccine group but died after, died later on, they actually died of cardiac conditions. And they were actually older than 60 years. So they were already vulnerable to cardiac diseases. So it was not due to infectious cause, it was not due to COVID-19 or due to the vaccine. So it was not a toxicological reason for death. It was actually a very purely biological reason.
Okay, very clear.
I think I have more specific.
Clear, Doctor. I think I have very good number of questions. So, Dr. Mansour is asking again, do you have any idea about the technology used for the CureVac vaccine?
Unfortunately, no, I don't have actually the information about the vaccine, but I think it is a traditional kind of vaccine. It is not the new technology that was used by Moderna and Pfizer.
Okay, clear. Another interesting question he's asking about, does the vaccinated person become a COVID mediator for others? It's a general question.
Yeah, so this question comes out a lot. So those who receive the vaccine, when we receive the vaccine intramuscularly, it goes to the blood, and the new technology, the messenger RNA technology that was developed by Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech, these are not actually the actual virus. So it's not going to go to the lung and replicate and produce the viruses in quantities and then goes up to the upper respiratory system and then it goes out when we cough or sneeze. So this is not the way that these vaccines work. So it just induces or stimulates the immune system to produce the antibodies and then it disappears. So the simple answer is no. People who receive the vaccine, they do not become carriers of the virus or they can disseminate it. And you can extrapolate this answer to other vaccines that we receive. When I receive the flu vaccine, do I carry the virus? Can I, when I cough or sneeze, am I going to transmit flu to other people? This is not the case. And same with the meningitis and pneumococcal vaccines. When we receive the vaccines, we do not carry the pathogen in its normal form, on its pathogenic form that is transmissible to other people.
Okay, doctor, very clear. Another question is asking, what about the cancer patients under chemotherapy or planned for later chemotherapy? Should they receive the vaccine? I think I can answer this. Dr. Abrar mentioned clearly in her presentation that those patients, during the neutropenia, they should not, receive the vaccines. They can be administered between the cycles, Or I can tell you from our experience that once those patients, especially the solid tumor patients, usually they take some time for to complete their workup and to complete the staging. Once they, I think, in my opinion, the vaccine should be offered in this phase during the initial phase of the treatment before starting the radiotherapy, or I mean chemotherapy or radiotherapy or other treatment modality, which makes them like more immunocompromised and became like more ineligible to receive those vaccines. Another question, Dr. Abrar, is from what about aplastic anemia? I think this is not our when. He's asking about the allergy. Does allergy to other medications apart from components of the vaccine will be contraindication for taking this vaccine?
So far, there has no releases from the manufacturers about allergy to other medications as a reason to avoid the receiving the currently available vaccines, because again, the vaccine components do not contain any particular pharmaceutical product, other than just excipients. So the short answer is no. Currently, there are no regulations or recommendations regarding avoiding the vaccine in people allergic to other medications. So and again, many of the patients who are in the high priority group are those with comorbidities who are receiving other medications, who might also have allergies to other medications, and they safely receive the vaccine. I also just want to add before we move to the next question. Sorry, I just checked the CureVac vaccine, and their technology is actually the messenger RNA, similar to Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech.
Doctora, do you have any preference? I mean, for the different techniques. I mean, in cancer patients, do you think that Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, because it's not containing the, it's only RNA. So do you think this will be a better option for, or they should receive any kind of vaccine if they are immunocompetent?
So in general, we need a healthy immune response because you need the immune system to be active, to be stimulated in order to produce the antibodies. But as a general recommendation, I think if we have a live attenuated vaccine, it would not be recommended. But the good news is that none of the vaccines that I discussed today is live attenuated. It is either a messenger RNA or a DNA vaccine, or they are the inactivated vaccines. So perhaps the viral vector, I'm not sure, but perhaps the viral vector, the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Russian vaccines, these are viral vectors. So these, I'm not quite sure. They might be risky for patients who are immunocompromised. So in this case, I would actually, be more lenient towards the new technologies, the messenger RNA, the DNA, or the inactivated vaccines, the Chinese or the Russian one.
Okay, a question from the audience. She's asking about patients who did after the mastectomy. She's talking about a breast cancer patient who is receiving hormonal treatment. She can get vaccine of COVID-19 or not. In my opinion, hormonal treatment is not like chemotherapy. It will not cause myelosuppression. So I think, yeah, why not? They are immunocompetent. They not especially those patients with who is not having invasive type of breast cancer, and they are not a candidate, or they are not, they will not be receiving adjuvant chemotherapy. I think yes, they'll be eligible because their immune system is still working. It's not like other patients who are receiving the myelosuppressive agents. Dr. Abrar, do you agree with me or?
Yes, definitely, I agree. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Another question is about contraindication in patients who have epilepsy or Crohn's disease. Is there any contraindication for those vaccines?
Again, the manufacturers, their only contraindication was the allergy to any of the vaccine components. There are zero contraindications other than this one. And again, as far as patients on with Crohn's disease, if they are receiving immunosuppressants like infliximab or other immune or like biological products, or like high doses of steroids, they will be in the same boat as the solid organ transplant patients who also continuously receive immunosuppressant therapy. Again, such patients, because of the weak immune status, might be at risk for a severe form of COVID-19. So they may benefit actually of the COVID-19 vaccine, even though it may not provide sufficient number of antibodies in comparison with the healthy people. So yes, I would still recommend giving the vaccine to these people.
Okay, great. One of the audience is asking about the vaccine given to the patients or healthy. I mean, all of those are 2 doses, like Pfizer vaccine, or some of them
So
would be
far,
less.
yes. So far, all the vaccines that I mentioned today are actually 2 doses. The Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and AstraZeneca's vaccines. All these are actually 2 doses, and the Chinese as well. So all these are 2 doses. Unfortunately, we're still waiting for other companies to announce that their vaccine is given at 1 dose. But yeah, all of them are 2 doses.
Excellent. Is there any contraindication in children who are on chemotherapy?
Okay,
Is there
so
any
the
yeah,
okay, so in
general?
general, yeah, so in general, none of the vaccine trials included pediatric patients. So we do not know the safety nor the efficacy of these vaccines in this group of patients. So they are actually advised to continue with the other guidance against COVID-19, the social distancing, the quarantining, the masks, the sanitizing, and so forth. Until we know whether or not these vaccines are safe in pediatrics, we cannot provide actually an answer.
Excellent. Another question is about the 2 doses. What is the time interval between those 2 doses?
So for all the vaccines that are administered in 2 doses, Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, the time is about 3 weeks, 3 weeks to 1 month.
Okay, very clear. Another question is about glioma patients when it's the proper time to get vaccinated post-chemo. Again, as Dr. Abrar mentioned that regardless, of the diagnosis, all cancer patients should receive the vaccine before the chemo or therapy or during the cycles, regardless glioma or breast cancer or colorectal cancer. Those patients should be having should be receiving the vaccine before being neutropenic or having the immunosuppression from the treatment. Okay, I think another very specific question. Do you recommend the vaccine for patients with autoimmune disease?
Unfortunately, I don't have specific answer to this. And I don't have also information of whether or not I don't think that the clinical trials, they did not include specific kind of patients with immune disorders, whether, patients or people who are receiving immunosuppressants, patients with cancers, as I mentioned, or even autoimmune disease. So as long as we don't have efficacy and safety data in these patients, I cannot provide recommendation. So I would say perhaps be cautious in this regard.
Okay, excellent. I think we'll take the last question about the safety of those vaccines in pregnant patients and breastfeeding mothers.
So again, similar to the other answers that I mentioned, the clinical trials did not also include pregnant or breastfeeding mothers because it's kind of risky to study these agents in this group of patients, also not even in animal studies. They were not studied in pregnant animals to declare their safety. So far, I think this group of patients, or this group of people, like pregnant women and breastfeeding women, are not among the group of patients who are candidates to receive the vaccine.
Dr. Majid, sound, please.
Yes, Dr. Abrar, if you allow me for one more question before we
Sure.
conclude this webinar. I think it's an important question to answer. The attendees think about the COVID vaccine efficacy against new variants of the virus.
The manufacturers, they said that they claim that their vaccines are not impacted by the variation of the COVID-19. They said that even the variation, because it happens in the spikes of the virus. So they mentioned that their vaccine, they claim that their vaccines are still effective. So again, we are yet to see that in the post-marketing surveillance, especially in countries where the new variant of the virus has emerged and spread in large areas. But that's the claim of the manufacturers. So I'm just conveying their recommendations.
Okay, excellent, Dr. Abrar. So I think with this question, I would like to thank you again, and I would like also to thank the event management company, Event Group, for their great effort to organize this nice meeting and webinar. And I wish you all the best, inshallah. Stay safe, and thank you so much for all of our online attendees, and see you on another, inshallah, interesting activity soon. Thank you, Dr. Abrar.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.